Hello and welcome to China Focus. I'm Shelley Zhang. People in Hong Kong rang in the New Year on Tuesday with a tradition that's a little harder to enjoy in the mainland. That is protesting, and specifically protesting their chief executive, Leung Chun-ying, also known as C.Y. Leung. Now, Leung was elected last year, and he's been a controversial figure since then. But it's not just about his personal unpopularity. And there are actually two protests on New Year's Day, one pro-Leung and one against him. Here today to talk about those protests and what they mean for Hong Kong's future, we have Matt Ganesa and Karen Chang. So what were those protests about, Karen?
Well, like you said, Shelley, the protesters were mostly directed at Leung Chun-ying, specifically asking him to step down. Now, there's been a recent development against Leung that has basically called into question his integrity, and that's around the issue of illegal structures that he had in his home. Now, this particular issue came up during the elections during July, and it was actually a matter that Leung used to attack his opponent, Henry Tang, and he was actually not selected afterwards. And Leung Chun-ying had actually first denied that he knew about the illegal structures, but in December he came out and said he was sorry and he knew that they were illegal. And basically this got a lot of people angry and calling into question whether he was trustworthy, and the protest on Tuesday were basically for him to step down.
Yeah, I think there's sort of a number of issues related to that too. I mean, he built stuff in his home. We built extensions to his home and didn't, file for the permits, didn't pay the proper taxes. But it kind of like the way that he did it brought up so many different issues. Like there's the skyrocketing property values and people can't find apartments or homes in Hong Kong. Kind of brought that up. Brought up the issue, of course, as you mentioned, the integrity in the elections. And also, I think it's just kind of this general idea of the wealthy being able to kind of get around the law and hiding their way through it.
And Leung Chun-ying made it worse because he was actually a property surveyor before he was elected, so he should have known, what he was doing.
Yeah, I probably should have known.
So is the issue just Leung's illegal building additions to his property, or is there something else going on here?
I think people generally don't like him. Not everybody, of course, but a lot of Hong Kongers don't like him, largely because they feel he's too pro-Beijing, that is, too pro-Communist Party, and is kind of generally willing to infringe on the rights of Hong Kong people.
During the election, there was issues being brought up that he may have been an underground Communist Party member. Leung has denied that, but that kind of stuck with him. And a lot of people were also complaining about how he was elected. Hong Kong was promised to have universal suffrage back when it was handed back to China in 1997, but the Chinese regime kept pushing that back. And Leung was basically elected by like 687 people back in July. And people were saying he does not represent the interests of the general public in Hong Kong.
Well, I mean, that makes sense because the way the election works, it's not just like the people vote directly for him, right? So there's half the votes are from essentially special interest groups and roughly half are from the people. So even if the majority of people don't want him, if all the special interest groups do, which basically they did, then he gets elected. So it represents, yes, the special interest groups, a lot of businesses and so on, which are mostly pro-Beijing, but not necessarily the people. And that's just partly a reflection of the way that Hong Kong's election system works.
So that's also why Leung survived a no-confidence vote last month, because the special interest groups basically kept him in. Is there kind of a connection between this particular protests and the protests we saw over the summer over Hong Kong's national education curriculum?
I think there is. Basically, it's just a furthering of the call against the Chinese Communist Party trying to exert influence into Hong Kong. Now, that national education plan, a lot of people saw it as a move to brainwash Hong Kong kids to basically glorify the Chinese regime and attack other political systems. And in this particular one, people were bringing up the fact that they are proud Hong Kongese instead of a Chinese person. So that distinction is becoming clearer in the minds of Hong Kong people.
So one of the issues that came up over the summer with those national education curriculums was the issue of Hong Kong's civil liberties being encroached on. People felt that if you're teaching this kind of version of history, you would lose some of the things that people in Hong Kong really want to talk about, like Tiananmen Square massacre, things like that. Are there further signs that Hong Kong's civil liberties are being eroded? Is that one of the issues in this particular protest?
Well, I think there's constant signs of that. I mean, remember back in '97, when the handover from British rule took place, Beijing basically promised 50年不变, right? 50 years, no change. That is, for 50 years, they weren't going to change the political system. But within just 5 years, they started to try to implement changes. And so Hong Kongers are saying, with everything that Beijing does to try to bring Hong Kong politically more towards the communist system, Hong Kong is like, whoa, hold up, we don't want this. And so it's manifested with the national education curriculum. Partly this whole thing against C.Y. Leung is not just the way he handled the construction in his house. It's also just like, this is also a way to kind of show that they don't like him, or to sort of get rid of him, or to basically talk about how he's a bad guy. And they can use this as an excuse because he did something illegal. But there's a whole host of other issues that aren't technically illegal that Hong Kongers don't like.
Yeah, I think the main thing Hong Kong people want to protect is the civil liberties that they have. During the protest, you saw people waving the British flag around. Now, that's basically saying, remember the good old times that we had the freedom to protest, we had the freedom, a freer press, things like that.
So you said when they had the right to protest, but they're protesting now. Are we really seeing something that could, infringe to that level where people in Hong Kong won't be able to have like the freedom of assembly, things like that anymore?
Well, there were reports about protesters saying police were purposefully trying to block where they were trying to go. And Hong Kong people have been reporting more and more about what police are doing to basically restrict what protesters can do. And that is something they fear in the future that's going to become worse.
So what about the pro-Leung protests that happened earlier in the...
This is actually quite interesting. If you read about it in the New York Times, it looks like, there's there's group that's for Leung and one group that's against. But the reality is that the group that's for Leung actually isn't just, it's not just, there's two groups with different, equally legitimate views. The group that's for Leung actually, we found out later, a lot of those people were actually getting paid 250 Hong Kong dollars, it's about $30, to be involved in those protests. And you can actually look at this video of someone actually receiving a payment for being involved in those protests. So what does it say that people who are pro-Leung have to be paid to participate in those protests? And even so, those protests were that were for Leung were only about a third of the size of the ones that were against Leung.
So almost 10 years ago, there was the issue of Article 23, which the Hong Kong government tried to pass laws that would restrict freedom of speech in a lot of ways for Hong Kong. Now, the government ended up backing down because of mass protests over that issue. Are we seeing kind of like a second wave here? Is this kind of are we seeing civil liberties being threatened to the same extent? Are we going to see the people, resisting and therefore the government backing down? Or do you think this is something that the government is just going to escalate?
Well, those protests against Article 23 almost 10 years ago, there 500,000 people took to the streets. The protests that are happening, that happened on New Year's and also that happened last summer related to the national education curriculum, were not as big in terms of the numbers, but also the national education curriculum wasn't as directly threatening as Article 23 basically said that, if it had passed, it would have allowed police to basically go in and search people's homes without a warrant, just on suspicion. It was very, very dangerous for Hong Kong people. I think now there's not quite as much direct threat, so you're not seeing quite the numbers, but because you see so many Hong Kong people constantly coming out to protest what the Hong Kong government is doing, it does show that there's still a lot of undercurrent of dissatisfaction and anger towards the Hong Kong government.
And I think what we didn't have 10 years ago was this flourish of social media. Even though not as many people are protesting, there's social media pages on Facebook set up to call for Leung Chun-ying to step down. So while people aren't physically appearing on the streets, these kind of sentiment are being passed around online.
And interestingly, if people in mainland China, especially if they can get around the censorship, are also more easily able to access information about what's happening in Hong Kong. So in terms of the numbers of protesters, it's smaller now, at least of these particular ones, but in terms of the impact of them, it could be much, much bigger because the influence is now able to spill over to China, mainland China, much more easily.
So do you think that means the Hong Kong government is going to back down, or is it going to kind of try to slowly escalate in a more subtle way than with Article 23?
Well, they may have to back down on certain issues. They certainly backed down on the national education curriculum last summer. But I'm sure that C.Y. Leung is going to stay in office for a little while, despite the protests. every time Hong Kong backs down, it also causes a ripple effect in mainland China where people, have these ideas that they could be bolder. But Hong Kong also, the government sometimes has to step down because the protests are just too strong. So it's always kind of a balancing game.
So we're not going to see this change anytime soon?
I don't think so. It's interestingly enough, people were drawing parallels to the protests now, what's going to happen to CY Leung, back to what happened to Dong Jihua, the first chief executive of Hong Kong. Now, he was forced to step down before his term finished. People were wondering whether it's going to happen to CY Leung in this particular case as well. But what I was reading was basically it's not really up to him. It's whether the communist regime in Beijing will allow him to step down. Interestingly enough, Xinhua News Agency actually reported about the protest on Tuesday, and they actually mentioned that people were calling for him to step down, and some people were reading a bit into that, saying maybe they're trying to hint at something that they may not be fully supportive of what CY Leung was doing.
Okay, so he could end up being the scapegoat for all this.
Perhaps.
All right. Well, thank you both for joining us and talking about this, and thank you for watching. For more on this and other issues in China, join us at ntd.tv.